Welcome, Alma, to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about this.
I'm excited. We met almost a year ago at Samantha weekend.
So, yeah.
And we kind of didn't get into much of a conversation, but you're a fucking rock star.
Aw.
So you're an author. Tell me what you do for work as well.
Yeah. So I do a couple of things for work. I'm one of those people that sometimes coped with trauma by over educating myself and just being in school all the time because education became kind of like a safe haven for me. Mm-hmm. So like I remember like when I was having like a crazy tumultuous like childhood, school and teachers were always like who came through for me. And so I just got really like into education. And so because of that, I ended up just like, I have like 2 master's degrees and a PhD. They're all in education. I am really passionate about, I'm a first generation Mexicana born here in the States. My parents were both immigrants. And so I got really, really like encouraged to pursue like higher education, which was a new thing for my family because no one graduated from high school before me.
Yes. So I'm a first generation American as well. Both of my parents were born and raised in Dominican Republic.
Okay.
And me and my brother were like the first kids, that they had here in the States. And they pushed education so much on me, but it made me not want to.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's my kids right now. Because I was so like pro education.
Yeah.
What's crazy is my parents were like, get good grades, but to them, they were just like, oh my gosh, you're going to graduate from high school. That's amazing.
For sure.
That was like their epitome of making it in terms of education because they had never even gone through like middle school. Like, because in Mexico, you have to pay for that. And so if you're poor, basically, you don't get an education, which just really sucks. But because of that, they were just like, yeah, just go to, just finish high school. That was like the goal. And so I was like, okay, cool. Like I accomplished it. Now what? I kind of had to develop like my own. I think the lack of them pressuring me for more is what made me be like, wait, there's more, guys. Like, have you heard of college?
Have you heard of a bachelor's degree?
Yeah. So I had to I felt like I was learning it and telling them about it. And they were like, well, I don't know what that is, but go for it, mija, just super like trying to be supportive or whatever. And then for a time they gave up about it because they were like, can you just get a job now? Like you've been in education, you've been getting these degrees forever. Like just get a job, like do something with your life. I'm like, I'm sorry, I have a master's. That's not good enough for you. Got it. Yeah, it was crazy. It was a crazy experience because they don't know, mm-hmm. Like I'm sure your parents also, like you mentioned, being like first generation here, even though they were into education.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if they knew what it meant to have that here, in the States.
Yeah. I don't even think my dad graduated from high school in the Dominican Republic. And I think my mom finished school here for like a diploma. Wow. But they, they're like, girl, just finish high school. And it's a miracle, especially being in my addiction in high school. Mm-hmm. It's a miracle I graduated.
That's pretty awesome, actually. Yeah.
No, I was so close to not, and I made it. And they did push college. They were like, oh, I mean, you should, but we're really happy you finished high school.
Yeah.
And I kind of didn't want to. I just really was not interested. I also didn't have like a direction or an idea of where I wanted to go. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to be that person that kept switching majors.
Yeah.
And then you end up being in school so much longer.
Yeah.
And I've been really against education, honestly, in a way of like continuing education because I see it as like a scam. Mm-hmm. And almost like power to the man. Like, I don't want to give into it. I don't want to be in student loan debt. Yeah. And all those things.
I definitely feel like that now, too. Even though I have all these degrees. One of the things that I realized through getting my PhD program was that in a lot of ways, we were replicating the problems that we have in education because at that level, it's very political. And it's like a lot of white old men teaching me about life or like these studies. And whenever I would say like, hey, I want to focus on Latinos and like their educational attainment, which just means like, how do they get into college? How do they access those institutions basically? And they were just like, well, let's just focus on everyone, like they were just very like colorblind ideology about it, which is like, I don't know if you've heard of this term, but it's basically like this erroneous belief that you're being more just by saying, let's just focus on everyone instead of like wanting to focus on a particular population.
Why do you want to focus on a particular population?
Because to me, that's who I cared about. And I was like, we see the numbers that it's like like in higher ed, the folks, when you see the percentages of people who complete education, it's wealthy white people. That's who gets educated in this country, because partly it is about, who can afford it, because it's so freaking expensive, and you're going to go into debt, and partly also because it's kind of catered to middle class kind of like values, like, like going to education. Like, for example, like I have a lot of students that I've supported through the nonprofit that I work for. Like they're balancing like being caretakers sometimes for their own parents, while also trying to get a college education and having to work to like help themselves get through that. And like that's something that is very unique to like low income populations as well, because if they were if they were middle high income, they could just pay for all of that, like they wouldn't have to worry about all the other things, like their parents would be in a home or have a caretaker at home, exactly. These things. And so it's education, unfortunately, in our country is very much like if you're rich and wealthy, you're going to get more educated than not, so to me, I saw it as an equity issue. That's why I got really into it.
Sweet.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's a main part of why I didn't go. It's like, I don't want to put any financial burden, and I really don't want to be in debt so young.
Yeah.
And then I have this belief that I can accomplish what I need without a degree of some sort. There's certain jobs, of course, you do need one, like a therapist, for example. But I'm like, I have this mindset of like, I don't need it. But like more recently, I've been a little more open-minded.
Yeah. Well, the market has changed too, I think. There's a lot of things, I think, especially like during COVID or like post-COVID, that people have realized, like reevaluated kind of like what they want in life. And instead of being sucked into like a capitalist, like, like machine that just wants to churn you out for your like, for what you can contribute to it. Like they've thought about like, no, I want to give back in this special way to like this community, or I want to work in this, even if it means I may never buy a house, or even if it means blah, 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 like they're more value driven. I feel like, I don't know, maybe you've always been that way. Like it sounds like you've always kind of felt like, I can find another way to make my dreams happen. Yeah. And that's totally cool too. Like one of the things that I think is a misconception is just because I really promote like this for a specific population doesn't mean that I feel like or look down on people that don't, because I feel like there are people who have, one of the other things that college has been shown to do is like provide a network of professionals that you can start to like network with, so that you can get those kinds of jobs that you might be working towards. And some people who, like, let's say for instance, my mom was a seamstress, so she like sewed clothes at a sweatshop in LA like all my life. And that's where she met my stepdad, who I call my father because he raised me. And he also worked there. He was like someone who used to like iron the clothing before they sent it off to like all these like bougie stores, to sell for like a lot more money than they made. Yeah. And like they were able to introduce me to people in that network. So like, I didn't want to be a seamstress. Like I didn't want to work, you know what I'm saying? And like, we were like pretty poor. So like, I think the wealthiest people I knew were probably teachers. Like at that time, like that's who I knew as like, whoa, they have real jobs and make a salary. Like, whoa, and they're so freaking underpaid. Yeah. Right. But like back then I remember thinking like, they're so rich.
They've made
it, and I'm just like, wow, they really don't get paid well enough here. But anyway, so to me, it was like, that's one of the things that I also learned through my studies, that like who matters a lot too,
That's very true.
So if you don't have a network, one way you can get one is also through college and like, or internship experiences, or putting yourself out there. But that might be hard if you don't have any, education sometimes, if you don't have that network to begin with.
Exactly.
So,
and there's also, so you do like education reform kind of work?
I do. So I guess to answer your initial question, like what I do is I have worked a lot in educational access. So,
access.
So like teaching people like how financial aid works, so that they're able, like for instance, a lot of people who are from low income backgrounds, they don't know that most of college will be paid through grants, which is free money to you. Yeah. You don't have to pay the government back or anyone back. Like for instance, when I went to college, all my college was paid for. Even when I transferred to
wow.
I started out at a community college and then I transferred to UCLA. And UCLA has an agreement here in LA where if you come from certain zip codes, they know that you're heck of poor. So they basically are like, let me give you money to come, girl, because you gonna struggle here. So they gave me like a full ride.
Wow.
Yeah, so I didn't have to pay for my BA.
That's awesome.
You know, and then after that, I had to pay a whole lot of money for my master's and stuff, which I still owe. So to your point, like, yeah, you do get in debt, you know, but it's also kind of, I'm seeing it like, yeah, it was my investment, like to like figure out kind of what I needed to do in this life and do the stuff that I loved, you know.
Did you hear this thing where like millions of people didn't pay their student debt recently?
Yeah, I mean, I was probably one of them because I was like, first of all, y'all need to like pardon this. Like, I don't understand why this hasn't. Well, one, I really believe in a free college education. Like our country, I don't know if you know, but like for one of the most like advanced countries or like, you know, that are considered kind of like the wealthier countries, we're one of the few that actually charge our citizens for college education.
Yeah.
Other countries, this is what they invest in. They invest
Yes.
in their folks being smart and like learning in this specific way, right? Like I'm not saying there's not other ways that you can become smart and like learn, but like they invest in that because they see that promotes like, you know, people getting degrees in things that the country needs in terms of like we have to outsource like engineers and a lot of different jobs from like other countries because we don't create enough here.
Wow.
Because people aren't going because it's so freaking expensive, you know? And so, yeah, there's a lot of problems in education, you know? And so I think that's why I stayed in it for so long and I'm still really like passionate about education.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So.
Do you believe that what we're teaching kids from like K through 12 needs to change, like anything about it?
Yeah, I feel like I've gone through seasons where like I think very differently about what's being taught. Like right now, I also work as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging coordinator, which is basically like a really fancy way of saying like, how can we do like less racist stuff in our school?
What's happening?
Or just like become more inclusive like to everyone and not just have a certain way that we teach things or that we promote things.
Can you give me an example of
for instance, like we have a very Eurocentric like history that we learn in the United States. Like we learn everything from the perspective of like, which is I know very controversial right now because there's a lot of states even in our country that have voted against, for example, like teaching about critical race theory, which I actually am one of the people that teaches this at a college level. So for instance, like I want people to learn their history and the ways that various minority populations who are actually not going to be minority very soon have like invested a lot of their labor and also their land to be able to provide what we have now, you know, like I'm thinking about, for example, the indigenous people that took care of this land before European colonizers came, for instance. Like we learned their history by being like, yeah, there was like these savages here, you know, and like it's so messed up like how we learned it. I mean, I think we've gotten a little bit better. But like
these savages,
that's how we freaking teach like about like indigenous folks who were here before and were taking care of the land and had this value system that was different before European colonizers came, talking about where's the gold at, which is all they were fucking, you know, like cared about. And so like, what if we actually taught people like from like a place of respect, like about indigeneity, and then also about how Mexican land was like made up like a third of the United States before, you know, and like how that created this unique culture. I'm not saying like F everything that's like European, but like I'm saying like, can we just like teach it in a way that honors all the different people that make up this country instead of this weird whitewashed, like white male centric history that we learn. You know, like, do I really need to learn like the names of all the like different presidents and like their birth dates? And no, I don't care. Like that has zero to do with me as a person.
Yeah, for sure.
So I feel like that could just be like one chapter of like, hey, these were the white people that like, you know, organized themselves to create this new democracy, but here's what it was like before and how like people have changed it to become this other thing now to make it more inclusive, you know?
Yeah, the only thing I recall from like before like the colonizers came was like the Louisiana Purchase or something where we were buying the land.
Yeah.
I remember, I can see in my head where we bought it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's what used to be Mexico. Now we have it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But that was it. That's all I recall.
Yeah. So in my graduate level course, that's kind of what I teach, how like at such a young age, we are already taught, for example, this idea of buying land. Like, why didn't we investigate that? Like, what do you mean we buy land, a free resource from the earth? Like, why don't we teach it as like, this is for all of us to use, but we got to buy it from people and have this relationship with land where you're like, it's not for us to own. Like if you learn from indigenous, like, like I recently went to a talk given by the Tongvan elder, and she was talking about how like they don't have that relationship with the earth. The earth is a source of gifts that are given to us to like basically take care of and continue to like grow for each other.
Yeah.
But
and live together,
right? And
yeah.
Like, you know, but that's not how we teach about the earth. We're like, oh, plots of land that you buy, you know, like that's another way of thinking about the world that's very like laden with value, that unless you like sit back and investigate, like, oh yeah, why are we taught that? Like you wouldn't realize like it's normalized.
Yeah.
We've normalized
I
that.
think it's really good in general to question things. Just like not always be so like, oh, you're telling me that, cool. Like that's true.
Yeah.
And I think it's really good, and something I've been trying to practice myself recently is to just question things here and there and see where my opinions lie and how I view it, my perspective.
I'm all about that. Like I just feel like that's true education.
Yeah.
Because now you're becoming awakened almost, you know, to like to like an idea, a way of thinking that is taking various viewpoints and seeing like, wait, what does this mean? Like what does this actually mean in the ways that like we understood this topic, for instance, you know? So it's like awareness, but at a societal kind of level, which is awesome.
Yeah. So you said you grew up so in your book, you kind of talk a little bit about, you were born in LA and grew up in Mexico?
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I actually really, I feel like that's kind of where why I am the way I am now, is because I got to see these like very different lives being lived in two different countries. So I was born in LA, but I was raised in Mexico, in Acapulco, which is like a very tropical and like humid kind of like paradise. It's like really beautiful there. And we lived in like we had dirt floors. Like we didn't have like, even like the streets were dirt. We had like a bunch of, like I had a mango tree, an almond tree, like lemon tree.
That's
like,
awesome.
You know, it was like really beautiful. Like I remember just like really enjoying, even though there was like some crazy circumstances as to why I was raised there. My mom had to basically send us back to Mexico to be raised by my grandparents so that she could like wire us money, because she was a single mom and didn't know, you know, like on a seamstress budget. So it's like, you know, it was really hard for her. So we had to be there so that she could make her dollars stretch, you know?
Yeah.
And so we were raised there. And, you know, I got to see all of that. And I actually went to Mexican school. So I learned like my first like national anthem was like the Mexican national anthem and all that, you know? So it's like in some ways very bicultural, because then when I came here and I learned, you know, a lot about the history here, I was just like really confused. Like I remember thinking like, whoa, like the way that we talk about like the US talks about itself here is so different than how I remember learning about it in Mexico, you know? And so
I'm really curious to see how you learned about it.
I just feel like it's almost like any other country. Like, you know, every country focuses on like telling the history from their perspective. And so then you start to feel like, oh yeah, this is the right way, or this is true, right? Or like the real kind of thing. And so since I learned it in Mexico first, and then I came here, I was like, oh, like this is really interesting. Like for instance, like the way that Mexico is seen here is like a poor country. Like, and I remember thinking like, I never felt poor, you know, of course we actually were poor but I didn't realize that as a child. But anyway, when I came to the US, I lived in LA in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And I remember, and it was during like the 80s. So it was like rough season. There was like a lot of drive-by shootings. Like when I was at the school that I grew up in, like we used to have to like hit the like turf all the time because there was like drive-by shootings by where where it was situated. And I remember thinking like, yeah, the US is like really ugly and violent. I remember thinking that, but I would learn about Mexico as being ugly and violent, but I was like, no, this is ugly and violent. Like over there, I was in a paradise. Like I was surrounded by nature.
No, yeah, 'cause I have this idea of Mexico that it's so violent.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure certain parts are. Yeah. Like I don't want to like say that like it's all good, you know?
Yeah.
But like we're violent here too. We have like school shootings all the time.
Does Mexico have that issue?
No, I don't think that's a thing. You know, I mean, we also have kidnappings though. Like they have a lot of like these like kidnappings that happen for like ransoms and stuff for educators because of, I don't know, they are considered to have resources or something. But, you know, I just remember like similar to like, so when I was growing up is when like the Watts Rebellion, or some people call it the Watts Riots, happened. And I learned from, most of my teachers were African American. And so I remember going home and watching like Spanish radio and syndicated television. And it was always like, you know, like painting this narrative about Black people being dangerous and like how we have to be careful. And like even my family was like very like, oh, you know, like be careful. Like we're very anti-Black kind of like sentiment.
My family was that way too, even though a lot of Dominicans
are Black. Yeah. I mean, same you know, since then I've learned a lot about Afro-Mexicanos, and it's like how my grandfather was actually Afro-Mexicano.
Yeah.
And so like I realized later, I was like, wow, we were like really like self-hating. Yeah. You know, like what was that about?
We still like ourselves, I guess.
Yeah. And so so then I remember like hearing these stories in my family and like Spanish TV and like painting people in this way. And then I would go to school and my teachers would like teach me like a different perspective. For instance, like real history about like slavery and like how people, I mean, African American or Africans were forced into basically like labor camps. I mean, I don't know what else to call what slavery was, you know, and like learning about that. And I was like, well, no shit, they're fucking mad. You know, like I would be rebelling too. I would be freaking rioting. Like what the hell? And so all of a sudden, like I had this historical context to why like this community was like going crazy after like the Rodney King's like beating. And then I was like, oh, well, yeah, like if you look at history and why things like this might explain why they're so mad, y'all. Like, you know, I just remember thinking that as a kid. And again, like, I don't know how many kids have that like different like cultural experience when they're growing up, where they're like seeing something at home, being like super anti-Black, but then going to school with a very pro-Black teacher who's like teaching you real history. And you're just like, wait, so who's right? Which adult is lying to me?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like what's happening here? And so I feel like all of those experiences like really made me become very critical and like question a lot of what is considered like history, what is considered like truth, because I just realized like, oh yeah, adults are just making this up, you know, like we're just kind of like based on whatever values or whatever you believe, that's what you end up believing. But if you investigate more of like, why is this happening? There's a whole other history to uncover there.
Yeah. There's a few things I want to ask you. I want to cover kind of, I think I read somewhere that you talk a lot about like intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
And then I also, let's cover that first.
Okay.
So what do you know about that? What is that?
Yeah. So intergenerational trauma is trauma that gets passed down, not just socially, like through, you know, grandparent to parent to child, but also biologically. So there's like a lot of research now, for example, that shows that specifically for women, like all of our eggs that we carry for reproduction, like we already have when we are infants in our mother's like uterus. So basically our grandmother also carries us, because the fetus, so like the mom already has all the eggs that are going to make the children. So like, it's so weird that biologically now we know, for example, that like a lot of the trauma, even from grandparents, get passed down to like another generation biologically. And that's not to say even like the social,
So it's like
trauma.
I was inside of my grandmother.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a fun fact.
Yeah, isn't it? Okay. When I learned that, I was like, I don't understand patriarchy now. I don't know why we went that route when there's like so many things that like show like women.
Why did we go that route?
I mean, I do know, but you know, it's like crazy. So one of the things that I talk a lot about in my book is that being a grandchild of alcoholics had a very similar kind of like, you know, it ended up making me very much resonate with a lot of people who are like children of alcoholics and like the emotional immaturity that they inherit from their parents. Because basically, you know, when people are alcoholics or are on drugs, there's a level of immaturity with like their emotions that they're not able to like really cope with and like work through, and therefore they don't pass down skills on like, for example, like how to take care of yourself, how to like feel validated or self-validate, right? Like, because that's what you're using like substances for. And so being a granddaughter of alcoholics, I had I have a mom who emotionally just was like never really present. You know, she just was not, she could not compute like emotions, you know? So like, so whenever like I would like have big emotions or like just want to ask tough questions, it was like immediate shutdown. Like we cannot talk about that. It is like not okay, which partly also explains why I want to question everything too, you know? And so that's what intergenerational trauma. It's basically like you are inheriting the ways that your predecessors coped with issues. And if there was ever alcoholism or any kind of trauma that they experienced and never worked through, you invariably end up getting that too, because now they're teaching you how to cope in the ways that they've coped, which hasn't been healthy.
Exactly.
You know? And so there's a lot of intergenerational trauma in my family because with my grandfather being alcoholic, even though he was present in a lot of ways, you know, like I think he was like financially present, like he like financially took care of his children. I don't think he did a very good job of emotionally being present. And so my mom ended up kind of learning from him and my grandma,
of course,
that like that was what parenting was, right? Like they didn't know any better either. And she never questioned it because she just thought that's what it was to be an adult, because that's what she saw. But then it wasn't until like I think my generation where we started to question a lot of that, because in our family there's also been like a lot of like domestic violence or intimate violence that I witnessed. Yeah, that I witnessed mostly other like my tias and like, you know, other women in my family. Thankfully not with my mom, but we did also experience a lot of physical violence like in my immediate like home. Like that was just part of like discipline for a long time with my parents. Yeah. You know, like just beating you up real good so you could learn.
I hate it. Like, I've experienced the same thing. It's like, no, I kind of just resent you now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it took a long time. They definitely, you know, once I was a teenager, because I was always kind of seen as like the black sheep because I questioned everything and like really pushed back on a lot. I feel like when I became a teenager, they finally started to like reevaluate their own parenting. And so I'm happy to say that at least they changed in their lifetime and I got to see it, which is crazy because a lot of people don't get to see that.
Exactly. You know? No, I've been having that same experience. Like, when I came out here and got sober, my parents I feel like they almost like just got so enlightened and started looking back at the past years and maybe how they reacted to certain things or how they were dealing with certain things, or maybe even changing their perspective on like life and God and stuff. I'm like, wow, my parents are like woke all of a sudden, and you decided to do this when I'm living on
which
my
also
own
makes
now.
you resentful because you're just like, how about you being that when I was a child? Like, how about that?
That was my point. I started getting a little angry. It's like, no, at the end of the day, I'm happy for them, and I wouldn't be the person I am today if it weren't for all those experiences.
Yeah. And you know, healing from intergenerational trauma too, it's really complicated because often in order for us to heal, we have to forgive people who haven't asked for forgiveness or who haven't necessarily felt that they've done anything wrong.
We're forgiving for us.
Yes, we are, you know, and that's something that I think is where it gets really challenging for people. Like as I've talked about my book and like those topics and, like in different interviews or like in front of different audiences, that's usually one of the questions I get is like, how do you change your parents, or like, how do you make them see? And like, how do you, when does the apology come, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, honestly, you might never see that in your lifetime. And they may never change, but you still are responsible for yourself.
Yes.
And your own like forgiving of what happened and finding a way to do that in a way that's authentic to you too. Because for a long time I was like, no, I totally forgive them, but I didn't really transformatively forgive them. I was just kind of like going through the motions. And to me, it had to look different than maybe like for someone else. Mm-hmm. It's an individual process, I feel like.
100%.
Yeah.
I went through that experience with my dad apologized for something specific. Wow. And I was like, wow, I was not expecting that. And I never thought you were ever going to bring that up.
Wow.
Yeah, that was really cool and random.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciated it though.
Yeah. That's awesome.
But there's like trauma that's embedded in our DNA, right?
Yes.
Like what things are those?
So
is it like reactions to things?
So I don't know much about the biological part of intergenerational trauma because that's not really my expertise. But I do know, for instance, in my family, we struggle a lot with anxiety and depression, and this is like generational. Like, so my biological father, I recently found out, had been he has been in and out of institutions for most of his adult life. And I didn't realize that he was actually bipolar, and that's why when he was acting out his manic states, he was doing really like violent, aggressive stuff to people. But then he just got incarcerated because, the way that our system's set up, like, if you're not taking care of yourself and you're acting out like this, then you're just kind of considered like, you're just going to have to pay the consequences of that. And so he was incarcerated, and then while he was incarcerated, they noticed that he just wasn't acting like correspondingly to what was going on. Like sometimes he would just kind of, go through those ups and downs, like really hard. Like he wouldn't like come out of his cell. Like he was just doing a lot of like depressive stuff. And then there were times when he was just like acting out manic stuff too. And that's when he got diagnosed in prison. And so then he was transferred to like a mental health facility where he had to live out the rest of his sentence. And I think to this day, I think he still kind of like struggles with taking his medication and accepting that it's like a thing, because he went untreated for so long too, that I think he's not all there anymore either. And so when I found this out like a couple of years ago, all of a sudden, like I told my sister, bro, you know how we've always been depressed and anxious like our whole lives? Like there's a reason, like our dad like totally has gone through all this stuff, because me, my sister, and my brother, all three of us like struggle with like anxiety and depression. But my mom, because of the way that she is, she was just like, I don't know what's wrong with y'all, like, like, I don't know why you can't just get over it.
I swear that's my mom.
Yeah, I know. It's just like, all right, thanks, lady. She just doesn't get it.
My mom really struggled with like the emotional comfort. She's so good. Like if you're like physically sick, like if you have like the flu or something, or if you like broke something, she was so good at just like, like I'll bandage you up, I'll make you some soup. But when it came to like emotional, that's where we lacked.
Yeah. And I think in the Latino community in general, I mean, I think it's becoming more like prevalent to talk about these things and to like figure out, like what depression is, anxiety. But back in the day, like if you were depressed, you were just lazy. Like get up, like do something with your life. Like why are you just laying there? It wasn't seen as something like, oh, maybe he has some like emotional or like mental health like issue going on, you know? And so like, I remember, growing up seeing either like my siblings or I go through like these seasons, and, we would just get called names instead, like, being lazy, huevon, like that was one that we heard a lot. Like, and also my parents didn't know how to like, I don't know if this is, like intergenerational, like biology, or if it's more of like coping mechanisms, but my parents didn't know how to relax, like how to have self-care and just chill
too.
Like just sit down on a couch for like more than 5 minutes and like just relax.
My dad can do it, but he smokes weed. Like my mom cannot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, it's interesting too, like when people have to like use a substance, like if how much of that is also like self-medicating.
It is.
Or like not learning your own ways to cope.
And I just also recently learned my dad has bipolar.
Oh,
like
really?
Diagnosed bipolar, right? And somebody told me like if you smoke weed and are bipolar, that can lead to like anger fits or something. I'm like, wow, that adds up. So the self-medicating thing is he's done that for a long time, and my mom hates it.
Yeah.
So much. And that caused a lot of fights and arguments. And then I also recently learned, like, we didn't talk about shit, period.
Sounds like a legit Latino family.
So I didn't know he struggled with substance use, like substance usage. Like he was addicted to opiates in the past.
What?
Yeah, I'm like,
so you recently learned this?
Yeah, in my sobriety.
Wow.
I'm like, what is going on?
Yeah.
But you're also sober as well, I think you mentioned before we started.
Yeah, so I didn't realize that I was struggling with anxiety and depression for so long. And so I would say that I was coping with alcohol for a really long time. So I never went through like a process where I hit a rock bottom or like even a soft bottom where like people talk about. But I've seen a therapist for long enough where he was like, I don't think you're an alcoholic. But if you know that alcohol is the way that you're like escaping a lot of like responsibility and that you're, rather than working on like yourself, that you're just like turning to this as a way to cope, then that makes sense that it's probably not good for you,
Yeah.
I also don't know if that he can like make that determination because I don't know that that's his specialty or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was while having, intensive therapy for a few years to like work on my own trauma that I realized that I had abused alcohol for a really long time, especially in my 20s. I feel like in my 20s, all I remember was like I would work. Like my memory, first of all, is foggy AF because of that. Because I just remember like drinking come like Friday night through the weekend and then sobering up for the week just to go to work and then starting the process over for like a few years at a time. So like I know that was, and because of that, like I didn't really develop a lot of like emotional coping mechanisms, right? Like how to deal with uncomfortable feelings and just sit and like let that just simmer and not like grasp for something. Like I was definitely using it as a way to cope.
Yeah.
And so I finally made a decision a few years back. I think this will be my 5th year to just eliminate alcohol from just my life and to really dig deep into like just my growth. And part of what allowed for me to even write my book was during my sobriety.
Nice.
So I realized like, wow, I could have really been doing like a lot more, a lot more with my life.
Right.
Like if I was sober, like I didn't realize how much of my life I had given up to alcohol until like until I stopped.
You don't realize it's holding you back until you realize it's holding you back.
Yeah, it was really crazy.
There's like no benefits to alcohol in your life.
No, I mean, I do remember feeling the high and the good.
I remember feeling drunk. That was good.
I mean, it felt like a benefit then and there.
No, for sure.
But then later you're like, wow, I'm just like a really immature adult. Like socio-emotionally. Like,
That's funny.
I know you mentioned Samantha earlier. This is one of the conversations that we've had, like how, because I really value how smart she is, like in a socio-emotional way. Like she has so much capacity for like stressful stuff that I would just be like folded over within like 10 minutes because I'm like, I can't, but she deals with this like high stress level stuff. And like she can show up so authentically for people. And I remember telling her one time, because she kept saying things about how she's not smart. I was like, bro, that is smart. Like I was so like socio-emotionally like dumb for so long, even though academically I can like theorize about really like, big words and like just, and kind of like put things on paper and read. Like socio-emotionally, I did not have any skills whatsoever. And so I talked to her about that because I'm just like, I'm smart in some ways, but like, that's not all of life, like
for sure.
You're definitely smart in other ways that I feel like I can learn a lot from. So
yeah, I feel like I can learn a lot from her as well. I really do look up to her. She's amazing.
Yeah.
So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about was kind of relating to what we were talking about with the Black community where you were growing up and kind of like what's happening now in the world. I wanted your take on Black Lives Matter. And like what first can you like run down what it is?
Yeah, I can run it down. I'm like, how far do I go back?
Yeah, like I just because I was in my addiction when it all started, and I just remember like riots, somebody got killed, and then riots, then Black Lives Matter. That's all I remember.
So let me fill you in. You're like, what happened these last 5 years?
Yeah.
So Black Lives Matter, I would say, is an offshoot of African American empowerment that has always happened in our society. This is very like US specific too, just as an FYI. Other countries have different histories because other countries didn't have, for example, like forced labor camps, like / slavery, which we did here. And other countries, there's like very different histories, right, in every country. And the reason why race and Black Lives Matter is so important in our country is because any rights or movement that African Americans have towards any type of equality or equity in the way that they are seen has come at a great cost to their community fighting for it. So like they've had to fight for the rights that they have for a very long time. And along that, fighting, like obviously and resistance, like other populations have joined in on that movement, because anti-Black racism is very, very prevalent in our society. And so in order to combat that, there's I would say like different waves and movements that have happened over time. The current iteration of it is Black Lives Matter. But before Black Lives mattered, Black lives still mattered to people. And even though it wasn't called that, there were people that were fighting for the lives of Black people and that were trying to fight for their own humanity. And so we have there's like so much I can say about this, but we have a very complicated history that has created a very anti-Black racist country that we live in. And there's a lot of undoing that we have to do at both, I think, both African Americans sometimes, because there's a lot of self-hate also in the African American community, all the way to like the whitest of white, richest person that needs to also come to terms with how they have benefited from the slavery and the labor that Black people, had in this country, and that were not able, they were unable to like benefit from their own labor in the ways that even the country was created, for instance. Like the reason we have an infrastructure now and the buildings that we have and all the things that first created the infrastructures and across our country was forced labor camps by African Americans predominantly, but also by indigenous people who were enslaved and other people that were enslaved that is like less known, but that also happened. And so they were not able to benefit from their own work in this country. And instead were basically, used for advancing a society and treating them less than human. And so that's kind of like the context in which I like to talk about Black Lives Matter, because I feel like without the context, it's like, what are all these Black people mad about? Like literally, like I've heard like headlines of like, what, this doesn't make sense. We're like, racism is in the past and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, it's not, because intergenerational wealth is also a thing. And so because we systematically like did not allow Black individuals to earn wages or wealth, and instead the wages and wealth that should have gone to them went to like the slave owners and their ability to move up the ladder, then that's why we have this society that became predominantly ran by white rich individuals, and that's who's on top in terms of like our society. So I guess all that to say that like that's how I understand it. It's hard to understand it without the context, and I specifically like to learn a lot from Black women. I feel like Black women over our history have really taught us a lot about intersectionality, for instance. Like even that term comes from a Black woman. I want to say her name is Kimberly. I'm forgetting her last name. But you know, it was a Black woman that came up even with that term. Like, what does intersectionality mean? It means like the ways that being a woman and a Black woman kind of is a, you know, intersects to like really create a lived experience that is unlike other lived experiences. Because now you know, you also get into like the gender like issues and the ways that we, you know, that we are sexist in our country as well in many ways, and hetero sexist in a lot of ways too. And so, you know, all the different kind of like intersections and the ways that I think predominantly Black women, because of their social positioning in a society that really underprivileges them, they're able to see those intersections a lot more clearer, and they're impacted by them a lot clearer. So
cool.
Yeah.
And then they've done a lot of spin-offs though. Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
With Blue Lives Matter. And is that just honoring
okay.
Is that just honoring like law enforcement lives?
Yeah, I think something that people misunderstand about Black Lives Matter is that the reason Black Lives Matter became like a term was because it's so obvious that like in our country, if you look at history, we have been a very anti-Black racist country. And so it was like a way to say like, hey, Black Lives Matter. Like, let's like, they are also human lives. They also have humanity, right? And then people who don't understand that don't understand the history of that, then feel threatened because they think that we're saying every other life sucks because only Black Lives Matter. But that's not what it's saying. And I think Blue Lives Matter became a thing because it was basically like during Black Lives Matter also became a thing because of the shootings and the killings that police officers were doing against the Black community. And so then the police officers, who also, by the way, have a whole set of issues within the police department, which is a whole other like episode that maybe you could like bring on an expert on. Like I'll give you like a snippet, but I know that for sure, like they also experience trauma on a day-to-day conversation and get zero treatment and then go back out on the streets and cause more harm. So I'm not like basically like putting police down. I'm just saying like they deal with real stuff that like, of course it makes them jumpy. And of course they end up making decisions that are like, why did you kill that person when they had no gun? You know, and it's because they're also living in a very triggered state. But anyway, that's my aside note. But Blue Lives Matter came up because it was almost like I guess police officers or people that support police officers thought that when Black Lives Matter came out, we were saying that their lives didn't matter. But I think all lives matter. Sure. Like that's true. All lives matter. But what Black Lives Matter is trying to say is that like in the past, in this country, Black lives have not mattered. And that's why we have to make this a thing, like a saying, so that we can investigate the ways that like, why do this group of people feel like we have to think about it in this way, as opposed to just being reactive and be like, well, yeah, Blue Lives Matter too, you know, like all lives matter. It's like, bro, that's not even the freaking argument here, you know? Mm-hmm. But anyway, I don't also want to dismiss the fact that like I mentioned, they're not saying that like Latino lives don't matter or other lives don't matter, you know. It's just that like we are predominantly anti-Black racist in this country. So that's why that became their slogan, I think, from, you know, not an expert on that specifically, but just knowing some of the history.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate all the insight you've brought here today.
Yeah, I know it might not be a very popular one.
No, and I think this is like a different perspective from people that I usually bring on.
Okay.
And I dig it.
Okay.
I really do. I really do.
I hope your listeners dig it. I feel like it really depends too on who you're talking to. I think a lot of people think that, that liberals or people that are very progressive have been brainwashed or think in a certain way because of politics.
There's a lot of things you could say, but I am personally somebody who wants to soak it all in.
Yeah.
And I've had conservatives come on. I've had liberals come on, but they don't really talk about it. So I really appreciate all the different point of views, because But then it's like when they're sitting here in front of me, I'm like, dude, I agree with everything you're saying. And you're sitting in front of me, like, I agree with everything you're saying. Yeah. So it's, everybody makes good points and everybody has different things that they focus on. And yeah, I can appreciate all of it. And at the end of the day, we're all breaking the stigma on whatever the topic is or whoever the person is. And I think we did a lot of stigma breaking today.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much, Alma.
Thanks for having me
on the podcast.
This was fun.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you.